El día de hoy continuaremos y daremos inicio a esta octava reunión. La dinámica será organizada de manera un poco diferente. Tendremos ahora primero la presentación del ponente y posteriormente tendremos un tiempo para preguntas y comentarios. De la misma manera, vayan formulando sus preguntas y les recuerdo que tenemos un micrófono en la parte de en medio para que puedan hacerlas una vez terminadas las presentaciones. Daremos inicio al primer bloque de ENASEM, que se titula Cambio climático y envejecimiento, y daremos inicio con la primera ponencia del doctor Joseph Saenz, a quien me permitiré presentar. El doctor Saenz es licenciado en Psicología de la Universidad de Texas y cuenta con un doctorado en Ciencias de la Salud de la Población en la University of Texas Medical Branch. Actualmente es profesor en el Edson College of Nursing and Health Innovation de la Universidad Estatal de Arizona y es miembro de la Asociación Americana de Población, Asociación Americana de Salud Pública, la Sociedad Americana de Gerontología y finalmente la Sociedad Internacional de Investigación sobre Alzheimer. Entonces, sin más preámbulo, le damos paso al doctor Joseph Saenz, por favor.
Gracias, buenos días. Soy Joseph Saenz de Arizona State University y voy a hablar sobre sequía y función cognitiva en personas mayores. Voy a hablar en inglés, pero si tienen alguna pregunta, por favor, pregúntenme en cualquier idioma. To start, climate change has been argued to be one of the largest threat to human health in the 21st century. We often see climate change associated with exposures like heat waves, flooding, and increased frequency of hurricanes. One of the things that climate change will also contribute to is an increase in the frequency and the severity of drought. Droughts are prolonged periods with abnormally low rainfall, and these are very important things to consider in the context of health. Between 2000 and 2019, about 1.5 billion people globally were affected by droughts. And with water being integral to life, we expect to see a lot of health effects of drought. One of the areas that has received a lot of attention is the effects of drought on diet and nutrition. Of course, when rainfall is low, this affects crops and agriculture, which could limit the food supply. As such, droughts have been associated with food insecurity, lower quality of diet, diminished food supplies, malnutrition, as well as stunting and obesity. Another large area of research has connected drought to poor mental health and increased stress. This ranges from worries about the drought directly, stress associated with the drought, but also to general psychological distress, anxiety, depression, and even suicide. There have not been studies so far that have looked at drought and how it relates with cognitive function in older adults. But what we've seen so far is that drought does seem to relate to risk factors for poor cognitive functioning. That is, drought relates with higher prevalence of food insecurity, more likelihood of being under or overweight, as well as depression. And all of these are things that relate with poor cognitive functioning. When we study drought, this is something that occurs globally, so it's very important to contextualize it in the environments in which we're looking. I'm going to be looking at droughts and cognitive functioning in the context of Mexico. Some of the things to situate this to understand the unique environment is that if we look at Mexico, 39% of people live in a municipality that is considered to be vulnerable to drought. We also see high employment in the agricultural sector, which is a sector that can be heavily influenced or is heavily reliant on rainfall. We also see rapid population aging. The population's growing older, there's more older adults, and prior studies have shown that older adults may be the ones that are most vulnerable to the health effects of drought. And we also see within older adults, there's higher rates of poverty. And this suggests that these older adults may be people that have fewer resources to draw from in the event of a drought occurring in their communities. So I think of these as different vulnerabilities within the population. And what we saw is in 2011, all of these vulnerabilities kind of joined when a drought started that persisted for about 2 years. The drought that occurred between 2011 and 2012 affected over 80% of Mexico. We saw that some estimates have put the effects leading to a reduction in about 10% of the national GDP. And there were some, of course, very large impacts on livestock and agricultural production as sectors that rely heavily on rainfall. This is just a collection of news articles that were going on at the time that the drought was occurring. I won't go into all of them, but just to draw your attention to the one in the center, where we see a cow is trying to eat off of a cactus to get some type of moisture in its diet. So the aims of this study are first to evaluate how people's level of exposure to this drought that occurred in 2011 to 2012 relates with their cognitive functioning. And the second goal of this is to evaluate how exposure to drought relates with different risk factors for cognitive functioning. And here I'm focusing on diet and nutrition outcomes and mental health and stress. The data source, I'm using a couple data sources. The first one here is the 2012 wave of the Mexican Health and Aging Study, or ENASEM by the abbreviation in Spanish. This is a data set that we use to get individual level data on people's health, their demographics, and their socioeconomic status. This is part of a longitudinal study that's been going since 2001, and when I'm looking at the data set, I'm looking at about 8,600 people. This is only a subsample of the data set because due to some of the data limitations, we could only look at people that had not moved between 2001 and 2012. To this data set where we have individual level information, we got information on droughts coming from the Comisión Nacional de Agua, which provides a data set that we could link to the individual level data at the municipality level, so we could understand what the level of drought was in people's municipalities of residence. To give an idea of what the data looks like, we have an individual, and then we can see from 2003 all the way onward, every single month was the municipality that they were living in going from no drought, abnormally dry, moderate drought, severe drought, extreme drought, or the highest level of drought, exceptional drought. To give an idea of the study timeline and what we're doing here, what the image here shows is the percent of Mexico that was in various stages of drought over time. But between these brackets here, we can see the drought that we're focusing on that started here in late 2010 and ended early in 2013. The Mexican Health and Aging Study completed field work where they collected health information on people here at the end, towards the end of 2012. So this kind of presents an ideal time to be looking at the health effects of drought because we're able to see people's level of health after the most severe portion of the drought has just ended. To quantify how exposed people were to drought, what we did is we looked at cumulative level of exposure by calculating the longest streak of consecutive months that a person's municipality was in drought, from October 2010 up until October 2012. How we measured cognitive functioning was first using a verbal learning task where people are given 8 words and they're asked to recall them immediately across 3 trials. And we also have a verbal recall task, which is the delayed recall of that list. These are tasks that really tap into people's memory. We also have a visual scanning task where people are given a symbol and they're asked to identify it every time it occurs on a sheet that shows multiple symbols, which is getting at people's executive function. And then we have a verbal fluency task where they have a minute to name as many animals as they can. And this is getting at people's language abilities. Now for the cognitive risk factors we evaluate, first we have depressive symptoms, which are asking about 9 different symptoms of depression that people experienced in the past week. And we also have stressors, including perceiving that people's report that their finances are poor, or people's reports that their health is poor overall. The other cognitive risk factor that we're looking at surrounds diet and nutrition, and there's two variables we're considering. The first is household food insecurity, which asks, have you not had money to buy food or ate less than you wanted to because there was not enough food? We also have weight change, which asks, has your weight decreased by 5 kilograms or more, increased by 5 kilograms or more, or remained stable? I should note that both of these questions refer to the last 2 years, and so this really gives us a good opportunity to look at the effects of drought, because we're looking back at this drought that happened in the last 2 years, and the questions are asking about the last 2 years. So we're really seeing dietary changes and food insecurity during the drought itself. We control for a couple other variables here, including age, gender, people's education, whether they lived in rural versus urban areas, as well as household wealth. We use various statistical approaches. I won't get into too much, but just here to say that we're using statistical approaches to control for those variables we saw in the last time, to try to get at the independent effect of drought that isn't explained by people's demographic characteristics. Just to give an idea of people's average level of exposure in the data set, this shows the maximum number of consecutive months that people in the data set were living in a community that was experiencing drought. To give some context, we see that some people in the study during these 2 years of the drought, they lived in a community that experienced no months in drought. But it ranges all the way to a few people here that lived in a community that all 24 months of the drought, their community was in a drought. But the average was about 8 months that people had a maximum of 8 consecutive months of exposure to drought in their municipality. And we see this large group here at 6 months, a lot of people that spent 6 months in consecutive drought in their community. I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time and move now to the regression results, where what we're seeing is the association between increased exposure to drought and those different cognitive and cognitive risk factor outcomes. The first thing I'm going to show are the cognitive variables as well as depression. And just to walk you through this here, what we're seeing is the effects of additional 6 months of drought. And the first thing is showing the effect of drought on people's verbal learning function. And what we see is the negative number here is indicating that an additional 6 months of drought exposure was associated with poor verbal learning performance. We also see drought exposure being related to poor verbal recall performance, but we don't see associations with visual scanning or verbal fluency performance. When we move to the cognitive risk factors, we see an association between increasing exposure to drought and higher depressive symptoms. Now moving on to some other cognitive risk factors, we see that people who had more exposure to drought in their communities had poorer self-rated health. They also had poorer self-rated finances and a higher likelihood of decreasing their weight 5 or more kilograms during the drought. But we don't see associations between level of exposure to drought and people's food insecurity. In the literature, there have been some studies that have suggested that certain groups might be more vulnerable to the effects of drought, and this includes women as well as people that are older. And so we do some tests to see if the effects of drought on these variables differ by gender and age. The first thing I'm showing here is the effect of drought on depressive symptoms for men and women. And we see that the effect of drought on depression seems to be driven by women, that women are the ones that are experiencing depression due to drought. And when we look at age differences, what we see is for the verbal learning task and the verbal recall task, it really only seems to be among people aged 65 and over where we're seeing these negative effects of drought on people's cognitive functioning. Of course, one of the things that we can think about in the context of climate exposures is it's usually not a linear relationship. As one thing goes up, it's not that the other one goes up linearly. If we think about something like temperature, people's health is usually pretty good when we're at comfortable temperatures, but as we get to very extreme temperatures that are very hot or extreme temperatures that are very cold, we could see poor health associated with that. And so we do some tests to see if there are these nonlinear effects. if the effect, instead of being a line, is a curve here. And what we see is for the visual scanning and the verbal fluency task, there seems to be this curve relationship here, where people have the highest level of cognitive functioning if they were exposed to about 6 to 8 months of drought, which is a little bit of a confusing finding. In addition, we see for poor self-rated health that there's also this curve relationship going on, where people's health seems to be best at about 6 to 8 months of consecutive exposure to drought. And so one of the things we had to ask is, given that this was a pretty severe drought, what are the communities that are being spared from drought? So who are these people that have 0 to 2 months of drought exposure? The first thing I'm going to show here is a map showing the severity of drought in June of 2011 at about the most severe point of the drought. And what we see is that communities in the northern regions of the country seem to be most affected, while in the southern regions of the country, that's where we're seeing the communities that seem to have the lowest level of exposure to drought. And so one of the things that we can think about is with climate change, there's likely to be a lot of effects on different exposures that people have. It's not just droughts, it's other things as well. And so we looked at other climate exposures that could be happening in the southern regions of the country during the time, and came across different reports of severe flooding that was going on in the southern regions of the country. We also saw various hurricanes that affected the southern regions of the country during this time period. And so it could be that maybe one of the reasons that these people in the southern regions of the country, what could be happening is maybe they were spared from drought and they're not getting health effects of drought, but they could be getting stress and health effects of other stressors in their communities, like flooding and hurricanes. So moving to some discussion to close up here a bit, our results suggested that increased exposure to drought during this severe drought from 2011 to 2012 was associated with worse cognitive functioning, particularly for verbal learning and verbal recall, which are memory tasks. We also saw that longer exposure to drought was associated with different risk factors for poor cognitive functioning, including higher levels of depression and poorer ratings of health and poorer ratings of people's finances. For diet and nutrition, we also saw that longer exposure to drought was associated with decreasing weight, so losing weight in late life. We also, these are things that we think of as mechanisms, these dietary, nutritional, and health and stress effects. But when we did some other analyses to see if the association between drought and cognitive functioning was explained by dietary and nutrition outcomes or stress, we did not find that these explain the effects of drought on cognition. And so this is a little confusing. We know that stress is a risk factor for poor cognitive functioning, and we know that stress was higher in communities that were affected by droughts. And so one of the reasons we think that maybe we're not seeing these explaining the effects of drought on cognitive functioning is maybe the most important time to be looking at stress was during the peak of the drought, which happened back in 2011. And when we're looking at the outcomes after the drought, maybe what we're seeing is just some lingering effects of stress, but not the major stress that was happening during the drought. We didn't see any evidence of effects of droughts on food insecurity, but this is not entirely surprising because we know that that if a drought happens in a region that produces food, it can affect food insecurity and food supplies for people that rely on food that comes from food-producing regions. For that reason, a drought in a food-producing region can affect food insecurity for people across the country. And we also found that certain groups seem to be more vulnerable to the effects of drought, specifically women as well as adults age 65 and over. And this is consistent with past work and suggests that droughts may be reinforcing existing disparities and existing vulnerabilities in the population. And some acknowledgements for the funding of this project, as well as the Mexican Health and Aging Study, ENASEM, and look forward to any questions that you have. Thank you.
Muchas gracias por su presentación, doctor Saenz.